So we're going to go into heat. One of the effects of climate change, of course, is the increased temperatures. We have looked at that extensively. Kidneys are highly sensitive organs, sometimes working as barometers to external stressors or toxicity. And we are going to move to Africa and have a look at what warming climates can do to kidneys. And we will have Annika Wernerson with us again, who is not only a rector at the Karolinska, but also a kidney pathologist. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I will talk about epidemics of chronic kidney disease in warmer climate. And my talk will be based on our research in Central America and Asia, actually. It all started in 2002, where a nephrologist in El Salvador reported that among 205 new dialysis patients, 135 had in 135, the cause of their kidney failure was unknown. It was not related to the most common causes of kidney failure worldwide, diabetes, hypertension, and primary glomerular diseases. And patients were predominantly men. They worked as farmers, and many of them had been exposed to agrochemicals. And at first, it was thought that this might be due to exposure to pesticides. But then there were reports, epidemiological studies showing that there was an association with heat stress. And in Sweden and many Western countries, it would have been natural to take kidney biopsies on these patients, but it's unusual to take kidney biopsies in these areas. Also because there are almost no renal pathologists, so there is very little competence among pathologists of kidney diseases. And after a while, there came also reports from Sri Lanka and later from India. And then you can ask yourself, if it is a big problem. Well, in the prevalence in a community in Nicaragua was 42% of the men had chronic kidney disease. And in another report, it was shown that the incidence of chronic kidney disease in Nicaragua in two communities were 25 times higher than in the US and Europe in the same age groups. So this new disease was called Mesoamerican nephropathy or chronic kidney disease of unknown cause. And it primarily affected male sugarcane workers working along the Pacific coast, here, in the lowland. And as I said, they were not associated with the most common causes of chronic kidney disease worldwide. So it also has a third name, CKD-NT, non-traditional causes. So the possible etiology have been discussed for a long time. And here you can see heat stress is one suggested risk factor, but different other has also been suggested. Toxic agents like pesticides. Metals like cadmium or lead, metabolic agents like uric acid, and different kinds of infections, leptospirosis for instance, and also different lifestyles and socioeconomic factors. And in 2011 or 12, Carl Gustav Welinder, who's here today, he came to me and said, Annika, we need to do biopsies on these patients. Carl Gustav had been collaborating with epidemiologists in this area for a long time. And I thought it was a good idea. So we started to plan studies together with a PhD student, Julia Wikström. And we have done studies in several countries, and we had a similar study design in all these studies. We collaborated closely with local clinicians, nephrologists, and epidemiologists. The inclusion criteria was CKD of unknown cause from endemic regions, and exclusion criteria was diabetes mellitus, uncontrolled hypertension, or significant proteinuria. And the analysis that were done was performed in the same labs at Karolinska Institutet and Karolinska University Hospital. We also had questionnaires where we asked about working history, medication, and liquid intake. So we did a study in El Salvador 2012 and a study in Nicaragua in 2014, and these have been published. And I will only go into these briefly, but before I would like to show you a couple of pictures from Nicaragua. And these are two CKD patients from León who were biopsied. And of course, I have permission from these patients to show the pictures. And here you can see that we are preparing kidney biopsies from the patients. And we also visited two patients. You can see the father and his son, both suffering from chronic kidney disease in their home in the village outside León. So to summarize very briefly, you can see these are small studies. In El Salvador, we had included 8 patients, and in Nicaragua, 19. But actually, when we went to El Salvador, we wasn't sure that we will have any patients included. Because to take a kidney biopsy, when you take that, you need to stay off work, manual labor for a week, and then they lose a lot of income. So we weren't sure at all that we will have any patients. But and in the second study in Nicaragua, we wanted to have younger patients and also with an earlier stage in their kidney disease, and that you can see here. And in the blood analysis from these patients, we saw that low potassium, sodium, and/or magnesium were common. And low potassium is very unusual among chronic kidney disease patients here in Sweden and in the usual causes of chronic kidney disease. And in urine analysis, we saw low-grade proteinuria in some patients. Many of the patients had markers of tubular injury. And we also looked at heavy metals, but we didn't find any toxic levels of heavy metals. We of course, investigated the biopsies with light microscopy, immunofluorescence, and electron microscopy, and we saw a combination of chronic tubular interstitial and glomerular changes. We saw only mild vascular changes, and we didn't find any immune deposits, so there is no sign of immune complex disease. That is a common cause here. And I'm not sure if you can recognize a kidney in a microscope, but I will show you some pictures. And to the left, you can see global glomerulosclerosis. It is a scar of a glomerulus that doesn't function anymore. With the arrow, you can see that. And in the remaining glomeruli, we saw signs of chronic ischemia with wrinkling of the capillaries and also a thickened Bowman's capsule. We saw tubular atrophy to the left, and we also saw scarring in the tissue, fibrosis in the renal tissue. The arteries were often normal, and the combination of normal arteries and glomerulosclerosis, a high degree of glomerulosclerosis, that is unusual. Because usually we see global glomerulosclerosis in hypertensive patients who also have vascular problems. We also saw varying degrees of inflammations in the biopsy. Well, and then we did 2 other studies in Asia. We did 1 study in Sri Lanka and 1 in India. These are also published. And to summarize even more briefly, we could say that the clinical characteristics and also the histopathology were very similar to what we had described in Central America. So we, of course, said maybe this could be the same disease. And as a pathologist, I, of course, wanted to correlate the findings I made in the microscope with possible or suggested etiologies. And then I could see, if I look at heat and also low water intake, which sometimes was a fact in these patients, it will result in dehydration and reduced renal perfusion. Heat could result in inflammation in tissue, that we know. Dehydration could result in tubular injury because the tubular epithelium is very sensitive for low oxygen. And reduced renal perfusion will result in glomerular ischemia, which we saw, which in turn could end up with glomerulosclerosis. The reduced renal perfusion could activate the RAS system and increase the reabsorption of sodium and excrete potassium. So that could explain the low potassium levels. And also these patients sweat a lot and lose a lot of salt. So that could also cause low sodium, which could also activate the ROS system. So it fits very well with the heat stress theory. What we also did was to save some of the kidney biopsy material for gene expression analysis. And it's a problem to do this kind of analysis in kidneys because the biopsies are so small, and of course we need to prioritize to do a good diagnostic work. So we saved some material, and we waited until the techniques were so good so that we were sure that we will have good analysis on these very exclusive materials. And the questions we asked ourselves is that could this help us to say if this is the same disease in Central America as in Asia? And can we have an increased knowledge about the pathogenesis? And these are preliminary data, it's not published. So we took the material from the studies in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Sri Lanka. From India, we were not allowed to bring any kidney tissue abroad. And we took controls from Swedish living donors. And we microdissected these kidney biopsies into a glomerular and tubular interstitial fraction, and we did RNA bulk sequencing. And I will try to brief you what this means, but here we can see up and down regulated genes in the glomeruli to the left and tubular interstitium to the right. So the red dots show up-regulated genes and the blue dots show down-regulated genes. And what we saw here was that the up-regulated genes were involved in inflammation, activation of the complement system, and also chemokine signaling. And here we compared Central America versus Sri Lanka. And here you can see that to the right, that there was almost the same gene expression in all these three regions. Whereas there were some up-regulated and down-regulated genes if you compare Central America and Sri Lanka in the glomeruli. But it's very similar, so we can say it tells us that it might be a similar underlying pathophysiology behind these cases in Central America and in Asia. And interestingly, when we looked further into this, we could see that the genes that were up-regulated were one part or pathway that was upregulated was thermogenesis, where the genes involved in regulation of body temperature. If we compare to controls and if we compare to a disease group, IgA nephropathy, patients from Sweden. So in summary, we could say that our biopsy studies support that heat stress is a very important risk factor for this disease, Mesoamerican nephropathy, or CKDU. And there are also other studies supporting this. I won't go into detail, but there are several studies which show this. And also it's not only a phenomenon among sugarcane workers, you can also see them in those who work at rice plantations in Central America. And this is interesting. If you implement or do intervention studies where you provide the workers with water and also that they will be able to rest in shade, the kidney function is improved. So that is also very important studies. And last year there was another interesting study showing a genetic component in this disease. To be a Native American is a risk factor for developing the disease, and actually that some gene variants might be protective to heat stress and dehydration. There are also studies from India that show the correlation between heat stress and this kidney disease. So in this year, Carl Gustav Welinder published a study in Journal of Internal Medicine where he used the HEAL criteria to investigate the causal relationship between MEN and the different suggested causative factors. And it was the same criteria that was used to show the causative relationship between smoking and lung cancer. And you can see here to there that all the boxes are ticked for heat here, whereas there is no evidence for the other suggested causative factors. So now we talked about Mesoamerican nephropathy, but we also see from epidemiological studies that living in a hot climate increases the risk of both acute and chronic disease in the general population. For instance, it was shown in Brazil that that high ambient temperature increased the risk for hospitalization due to acute renal disease, primarily among very young children, female, and also elderly. And also there was a study from last year showing that patients with CKD, they had a more rapid decline in their kidney function if they lived in a hot environment. And then you could ask yourself, is this a big problem? Well, do you know how common it is with chronic kidney disease worldwide? Nephrologists are not allowed to answer. Do you know? 10%. 10% of the population have chronic kidney disease. So it is a huge problem, actually. And to summarize, there is convincing evidence that heat stress is a major cause of Mesoamerican nephropathy. And this is a life-threatening disease in areas with high ambient temperature. And since it's mostly in middle-income and low-income countries where they have very limited access to dialysis and almost no renal transplantations, many patients die from this disease in an early age. And heat exposure and to live in a hot climate also is associated with an increased incidence of chronic kidney disease and acute chronic injury for vulnerable groups. And of course, continued global warming will increase this risk for patients both in these countries but also worldwide. And heat stress-induced kidney disease could be prevented. But first we have to acknowledge that it is a true problem, and then we have to find solutions to do preventive work. And as I said, I've been working with Julia Wikström, former PhD student, and Carl Gustav Elinder, but we have also very good collaboration with the clinicians in the countries where we have done these studies. So I thank you them all for this. And also I heard yesterday you had discussions about teaching students. And at KI, and my personal opinion is that we need to integrate this into our entire programs. It's not enough to have a week crash course in planetary health. And I talk about this when I talk to the medical students about kidney diseases. I tell them also a little about this story. So we should open our eyes and try to include it in all our teaching, I think. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Annika. Very interesting. We are now going to move to the city of Glasgow, where I've had the privilege of visiting our exciting next speaker. The city of Glasgow is at the epicenter, or one of the epicenters of aging research now in Europe, as many parts of the city show accelerated aging and shortened lifespans. And Professor Paul Shiels is leading an interdisciplinary team working on the aging process and what affects it and how we can prevent. So our question now is our changing environment. How can we not only cure accelerated aging but prevent accelerated aging?
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to speak here. It's a very new audience for me. Today I will give you a little overview of what we have been doing in Glasgow and how it may be pertinent to climate change and planetary health. But I will start with a classical perspective. Hippocrates and Galen. Hippocrates, famous for saying, "Let food be thy medicine." It's actually a misquote. It was said by Antoine Brillat-Savarin, a French physician in the 18th century, I think. Galen, it's better to treat the patient with food than with medicine, pertinent to this conference and what we've been hearing this morning. And the art of healing comes from nature, not from the physician. Now, what Hippocrates did say was that there are two things: science and opinion. The former begets knowledge, the latter ignorance. And that's really important today because in the field of research on aging and how it's perceived by the public, there is a lot of opinion. And it's important to understand how we age because today there are more people alive age 60 and over than any time in history. And that demographic is growing. And unfortunately, it's bringing with it a tsunami of age-related non-communicable diseases because our years of healthy living have not kept pace with an increase in lifespan over the past 150 years. Okay, so most of this increasing demographic of the aged is happening in the global south. There, it's a region in the world not always best equipped to deal with what's coming at it in this context. In particular, the cost of treating non-communicable diseases is staggering. Pre-COVID, these were figures I pulled that showed between 2010 and 2030, it was expected to cost $47 trillion US. And within Europe, that was about 1,000 billion a year just to deal with social inequalities in health. Post-COVID, that's only expected to grow, and the situation will be amplified further by growing social deprivation. This has created quite a toxic climate for many people wanting to get involved in research in aging. And what we have at the moment is a scenario, it's akin to Mandeville's travels. So Mandeville was an English knight in the 14th century who claimed to have gone to Tartary in the east and come back with tales of people who had dogs' heads or faces in their chest. They had one foot and would shade themselves from the sun by lying on their backs, or they would find cyclopean Amazonian women. A lot of what we hear today, certainly in the popular press, around treatments for aging and how we can reverse it are simply not true. We cannot reverse aging, but we can slow it down. Our state of knowledge is such that we know aging is malleable, and therefore if we can slow it, we can give ourselves more years of healthy living. What is happening and more in the global south as well as in Europe and North America, you see the appearance of this diseasome of aging. Now, these are distinct disease modalities. They're treated in a distinct fashion by clinicians, but they all share a common underpinning component of a dysregulated aging process that precedes the development of the disease. That diseasome and the dysregulated aging process that underpins it is affected by a change in environment. And what we see is a diminution of stress defenses that are marshaled by a gene called NRF2. NRF2 is a master regulator of most of your cellular defenses against stresses and toxins. We see a loss of diversity in our gut microbes. And I would remind you that we are a holobiont. We are composed of our own cells plus hundreds of millions of bacteria living on us and within us. There's also a growing inflammatory burden relevant to what Annika has just been saying. And there's a loss of physiological resilience and growing frailty. So Glasgow, where I work, the Green Hollow, interesting, it's a part of the world where we have Gaelic languages, and we have a word for a sense of belonging like Ocho Milnes. It's called duachas. It means belonging and integration within a place. We lose it, as I have in travelling. This was once the second city of the British Empire, but over the last century, it lost social cohesion. There was economic collapse within the city, and the effect has been to make Scotland the sick man of Europe, and Glasgow the sick man of Scotland. So, deaths per 100,000 in Europe, this is Scotland in red, sitting just below Albania. The rest of Europe does considerably better. Yet, if we look at Scotland by council areas or prefectures, this is the east end of Glasgow. This is what's skewing the picture. Everywhere else does relatively well. And within the east end of the city, we have the worst life expectancy for a male at birth, 54 years. And within the same city, within a 12-kilometre geographical radius, we have the best life expectancy for a male. So it's important for us to understand, therefore, what's driving this and how we age, and why a steep socioeconomic gradient within the city is driving that difference. So aging, from my perspective, is like the start of Anna Karenina. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is alike in its own way. We age like an unhappy family. We age in a very, very individual fashion. Aging is a process. It starts pre-conception and ends at death. It is not simply a collection of diseases at the end of your life. It's affected by your mom when you were in her womb, what her lifestyle and environment was like, and in turn, when your mom was in your grandmother's womb, what your grandmother's environment and lifestyle was like. This jumps generations to affect your trajectory of age-related health. And this also applies on the paternal and grandpaternal side, where recently we have shown that paternal and grandpaternal diets affect male health. This is something that is probably well established in Sweden already via the Overcalic study. The aging process is not passive, it's actively regulated. And if you can understand the pathways involved, they are manipulatable, they are malleable, and we can do so to improve our health over time and to compress morbidity at the end of our life. So we need to know what's going on in order to get better age-related health. This is the Shiels aging trajectory, 10, 40, 3 years ago at 60. A bit depressing looking at it, but I'm encouraged by the fact that I'm the oldest living male in my family. Most of the men die in their 50s. The women live into their 80s and 90s, generally due to stress and lifestyle. So I have a vested interest in trying to practice what I preach. So from the science, aging can be hallmarked into features that are common across taxa. So they're common to flies, to worms, to yeast, to mice, and humans. And it's been estimated if we could manipulate those hallmarks to improve health, we could add 25 years of good health to an individual. Whereas if we could cure cancer and cardiovascular disease, we would only be able to add 2 or 3 years of good health because of the wear and tear that's already accumulated. This also comes with a big economic hit as well, a savings around 7.1 trillion over 50 years. So you can see why many are interested from a business perspective and not just the science in this. For me, this is not the whole picture. If I make a crude analogy and we think of our body as a car, well, currently our medicine and biology allows us to fix bits of the car when they go wrong and keep the show on the road. What it cannot do is this: fix the car when it's put in the wrong place at the wrong time and it gets trashed. This is the impact of your environment on your biology when it goes catastrophically wrong. And we have used this concept to frame an exposome of aging, taking Christopher Wilde's original concept that was applied to cancer, and it's looking at life course biotic and abiotic exposures in their totality and how our environmental external exposome impacts our internal cellular and molecular processes to give us a defined trajectory of health. And interestingly, in the great debate between genes and environment, recent evidence looking at disease risks and disease trajectories indicates that environment wins hands down, explaining more than 70% of the variability between individuals. And again, this is not the whole picture. I've been interested in looking at a bioexposome because what we do know is biopsychosocial effects are major determinants of how we age. So from when you're a child, whether your parents are nurturing and supportive or whether they're abusive, do you have a supportive family or is it abusive? Do you have access to good education, good sports facilities, good transport, good nutrition? And another interesting observation is that Are you spiritual? People that practice a spirituality tend to live longer in better health. But overall, we need to be able to factor all these components into our understanding of how we age, because 3 simple environmental factors, namely pollution, tobacco smoke, and diet, are accounting for around 50% of mortality globally annually. Oh, here we go. So what myself and colleagues, many of whom are in this room, are trying to do is to work out what's going on and to get those on a poorer trajectory of age-related health up and fitter and healthier for longer in old age, bearing in mind that what's good for you in old age is not necessarily good for you when you're young, and vice versa. So that's antagonistic pleiotropy. And we've used the kidney as a model to do this, with chronic kidney disease being studied as a disease of accelerated aging, and kidney transplantation as a way of tracking normal healthy tissue over time. Ideally, using a geroscience approach, we're wanting to tackle the upstream effectors of aging prior to the onset of burden of lifestyle diseases and prior to the need to see a geriatrician. So essentially, we are bolting the stable door before the horse is left. In Glasgow, what we have observed is that the factors influencing age-related health between the deprived and the affluent is household income and diet, no surprise. Imbalanced nutrition, not eating sufficient fruit and vegetables. It's not complex. This is a very simple appraisal of diet within the city at great depth, but the take-home message is very simple. If you do not eat, sufficient portions of fruit and veg, you age faster. Many of our population eat none for a few weeks at a time. We also see changes in the gut microbes, leading to an overabundance of pathobionts that promote ill health, typically oral pathobionts. And we also see biopsychosocial effects, where bad psychology is associated with obesity and further ill health. So critically, diet appears to be a modulator of health in a setting of deprivation. That will be nothing new to many in this audience, but in the field of aging, it has been. It's also important that age cells in your body have a pro-inflammatory secretome. So the more old cells you have, the more inflamed you should be. Yet in Glasgow, in the general population, that explains less than 10% of the inter-individual variation in inflammatory burden. So we go back to this idea of diet being the single strongest lever for optimizing human health. And what we observe in Glasgow then with this imbalanced diet, how do we improve that? And we've gone to think about what people do when you engage with the deprived community. And many of them tend to think they are carnivores. They eat red meat several times a week. They do not eat lots of fruit and veg. So if you compare the health of an obligate carnivore to a human, you see the following. Big cats and domestic cats often suffer from hyperphosphatemia, poor renal function. Many of them have colorectal tumours and they have an elevated inflammatory burden. And then we go to Glasgow, and what we observe is are deprived, eating far too much meat, have poor renal function, often at a level of mild and moderate chronic kidney disease that essentially goes undiagnosed. Come out of this is the data, but I want to point out that it is linked to an inflammatory burden. It is also linked to an increased incidence of colorectal cancer in that population, just like the big cats. We are just another mammal. There's nothing overtly special about us other than we have colonized the globe a bit more. So obviously, reducing the amount of meat from domestic ruminants seems a no-brainer, and replacing it with plant-based protein, as indicated. Oh, I've lost a slide. Replacing that red meat with plant-based protein would reduce the burden of cardiovascular disease as has been reported, and it should improve the health of the Glaswegians. The other thing of eating too much red meat with that population is you have gut dysbiosis, more unfriendly bacteria in the guts. Typically, we find things that should be in the mouth. We see a loss of bacteria such as lactobacilli that should promote good health. So they are missing. And this fits well with an adverse exposome because our gut bugs have evolved with us as hominids over the past few million years. But with the development of industrialization and change in diets during the Anthropocene, then they're not really keeping up and they're becoming dysbiotic. And we really don't know the full implications of the changes that are occurring in our microbiome over time. And if you think back to what I was saying earlier, adverse exposomes have health effects that jump generations. Human aging is very heterogeneous, it's very gradual, and we have yet to see, the full deployment of this change within our own health sphere. So manipulating the exposome, at least on paper, seems relatively straightforward. We can change our diet. We can try and raise the activity of that gene, NRF2, that promotes most of your stress responses, that will help you adapt and survive in a more stressful environment. And indeed, many of the agents we need to do that are naturally occurring plant-based bioactives or microbial metabolites generated by the bugs that the Western diet does not support. It's been predicted, certainly within the UK from John Mathers and some of my colleagues in Glasgow, you can probably enhance at least health span by 10 years if we can just get towards a healthier diet and away from a standard Western diet with lots of ultra-processed foods. But there are those in the audience who know much more about that than me. So just in summary with this, climate change, of course, will therefore, just as deprivation has in Glasgow, accelerate aging. You will have psychosocial stress, poorer housing, greater access to pathogens. You're going to have a loss of green spaces. You will have epigenetic imbalance as a result and poorer age-related health. Modulating your exposome, as I said, at least on paper, looks straightforward. And it should be very, very effective, at least at making us more resilient to many of the changes that are occurring in our environment and that will occur over the remainder of our lifetime and the lifetime of our children and our grandchildren. The interventions seem simple. And actually, we now, which I haven't discussed today, have tools. We can measure our rate of aging biologically in real time so that we will know which ones work and which ones do not, with respect to making ourselves more physiologically resilient. So I'll finish by going back to Hippocrates. Despite all our sophistication and technology in our science and medicine, 3,000 years ago, the Greeks were saying, give everyone the right amount of nourishment and exercise, not too little, not too much. We would have found the safest way to health. And I'll just acknowledge my collaborators here, especially the Stenwinkel Lab, colleagues at the Karolinska, Richard Johnson from Denver, Denise Maffrey from Fluminense, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. We will get the chance to speak more with you later on. Well, we're going back to talking specifically about heat and heat-related mortality. We heard the figure of 60,000 deaths, 2022. So Bertil Forsberg from Umeå University is here to elaborate on observed changes in the effects of heat mortality. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me thank the organizers for inviting me. It's very interesting to listen to the presentations here and especially the solutions that are discussed. So why am I here? I consider myself as an air pollution researcher belonging to the same family as Tom Belander, for example, from Karolinska. So maybe I should say a few words about why I'm doing some research on heat effects. In the 1980s, I started to study short-term effects of air pollution on asthmatics, first in adults, and then in an EU project where we studied air pollution effects on children with asthma. And when you study effects of air pollution on asthma, you have to consider the effects of temperature, especially for asthma of cold days on aggravation of asthma. And this research led me into another European project, the AFEA project, where we studied short-term effects of air pollution on mortality and hospital admissions. And then it's often cardiorespiratory deaths and admissions that are interested. And then again, the temperature is important. Hot weather, but also cold days increase the acute events. So we, in such a project, saw temperature as a potential confounder. You could discuss whether, when you talk about heat waves, for example, if you should consider the pollutants that increase due to the hot weather as confounders, but both could be causal factors. And then I worked a lot with the study on ozone effects on mortality, and also became kind of expert on ozone when we prepared the WHO air quality guidelines in 2004, 2005, came out 2006, I think. And I was the nasty guy who always said that we don't treat ozone in the correct way. A lot of persons wanted to see ozone as a pollutant where there was a threshold. You have to come over a certain concentration to see any effects of ozone on mortality or asthma. But I meant that epidemiology didn't support that kind of association. So then I was invited to a WHO meeting on climate change to talk about ozone effects, because global warming increases the ground level concentrations of ozone, and that's also important from a health point of view. At that meeting I met Chris Eby, now in Seattle at University of Washington, and she invited me to a study that we're going to deal with heat wave effects on mortality in a number of cities. So we would represent Stockholm in that study, and we met at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to discuss how to go on to study heat wave effects. And I remember that people from Athens, they started to present how we could define a heat wave using absolute temperature. So when we go above 35, at least for 2 days or so, they meant this is the heat wave definition we should study the effects of. And we said, okay, then we can pick up our things and go home, because we don't have that kind of events in Stockholm. So we realized, of course, that we need that we have hot days also in the cold climate, and we need to have relative definitions of heat wave. I start with this figure just to underline that we have heat wave or heat-related mortality also in colder parts of the world. It's a matter of the relative level. WHO says that we have around 500,000 deaths per year because of hot weather. And this paper from last year estimates that about 1% of summer deaths are caused by heat waves occurring almost everywhere. In Europe, we have about 2% of summer deaths estimated as a result of heat waves. Today in my presentation I will discuss a bit about the effect of heat waves in the cold setting of Sweden. And then the important question, has climate change increased heat-related mortality? That's a rather tricky question. What indicators are used to study this question, and what differences in the trends are observed in different studies and different parts of the world? And finally, a bit also about the modifying factors and the role of adaptation. Obviously, we have factors that could reduce the effect of heat on mortality. A bit about the Swedish story then. In 2007 I was asked to participate in the National Climate and Vulnerability Assessment in the working group Water, Infections and Health. I'm not sure that there was an intention from the beginning to include effects of heat waves. We hadn't spoken much about that in Sweden at that time. But we started to do studies on the effect of hot weather, and the graph here is from Joachim Rocklöf's thesis. We presented first some results in the Swedish medical journal Läkartidningen, discussing what we saw, that heat is killing people also in Stockholm, and how warming could increase this problem. In the study from Joachim Rocklöf, we estimated the effect of 1 degree increase in the daily mean temperature about a certain threshold, and could see that the same day we had an increase about 1%. Mortality increased about almost 1% per degree increase. There was also a significant effect of yesterday, of an increase in the temperature yesterday. So we studied lagged effect. You can see that after some days you have maybe some kind of compensation. So it's interesting also to calculate the cumulative effects of 8 to 10 days. And that's also around 1% per 1 degree increase. When we had seen this, we started to argue that also in Sweden we should have, as in other countries, heat wave warning system that could inform people and also health authorities that now there's going to be a climate condition, a weather conditions that could have negative impacts. So we started to develop a heat warning system. We got the question 2011, I think it was, to develop this system. And our idea was then to find out thresholds where mortality increased 10% and 20%. And despite the introduction of this system, we in 2018 could calculate that we had around between 600 and 750 excess deaths because of the heat wave we experienced in 2018. In this paper we compared the observed deaths per week in 2017 with the observed deaths in 2018, and the two other estimates are based on the model we had created for the heat warning system, which seemed to be able to predict the effect quite acceptable. We have also in Sweden had a quite unique possibility to use historic data to study how the effect of heat has developed over time, since we had a time series of mortality data from Greater Stockholm which includes 110 years. So we have analyzed how the relative risk of extreme heat has changed over time, and also how the minimum mortality temperature, which is the temperature when the mortality is at as low as it ever gets. And we saw in this over this period, when the temperature increased 1.4 degrees, that the minimum mortality temperature increased about 0.8 degrees, and the relative risk for days exceeding the 98th percentile for the daily mean was about halved, from a relative risk around 1.2, 1.3 to about half of that. There was a tendency at the end of the period that maybe the relative increased again after this decline. We have also published a third paper I didn't include here, which discuss how the attributable fraction has changed. We also coming from non-Sweden, we also was concerned about maybe it's not correct to have the same threshold for the warning system in every part of Sweden. You know, in Italy, for example, I think they have 5 different thresholds for their warning system. And in this study we saw, when we included 14 cities, that the 3 cities in northern Sweden, they have for warning level 1, which means that we have at least 3 days about 27 as the maximum temperature. We have about 30% increase in the risk, while in the rest of the country there's 8-10% increase in mortality. Yes, going back to this important question, this is from a review paper, and when we discuss whether climate change has increased heat-related mortality, there are several indicators that could be used. There's not one answer. The answer could be different in different places and for different time periods, for different subgroups. And regarding the indicators, we could study how relative risk changed. We could study how this optimal temperature, minimum mortality temperature changed. We could calculate absolute numbers and excess ratio. It has been shown that there are large variations in the change of the minimum mortality temperature. Large differences between regions. There has been increases in the minimum mortality temperature and the temperature percent. But I think that my conclusion is that this study, which is the largest, I think, it's difficult to draw very firm conclusions from it. It might be that we have an increase in minimum mortality temperature, but I wouldn't be too sure about it. And there are also studies where we don't see the general decrease in relative risk, like this study from the Czech Republic, which doesn't have the typical results. In this study, we can see that heat-related relative risks, in fact, seem to increase, driven by women and elderly persons. And this is explained by the authors that it could have to do with socioeconomic status and socioeconomic conditions, that women have lower pensions and so on. Another problem is that these results are not adjusted for air pollution, and especially the effect of cold temperatures could perhaps be confounded by lower air pollution levels. We have heard about the 48,000 heat-related deaths in Europe 2023. It's been mentioned before. This figure shows deaths per 1 million. It's a study. It's based on modeling, and the temperature mortality associations for 2023 were modeled with data, with models from earlier years. So the estimation is not a simple sum up of observed deaths. But when the same type of model was used with data from 2000 to 2004, so the relative risk from that period was obtained, one could see that if the relative risk 2023 would have been the one that existed for 2000 to 2004, mortality would have been about 80% higher. There's also a paper published last year when the authors are rather critical about studies that do not consider the change in relative risk over time, which indicates an adaptation. And in this study, they used weekly mortality data, so it's a bit different than other studies. But their calculation over the years 2000 to 2022 was that we seem to tolerate 1 degree higher temperature per about 18 years, which corresponds to the reduction in the minimum mortality temperature seen in other studies. And one explanation for this is that economic growth makes air condition possible for more people. And as an example, they use Croatia, where one can see that during the more recent years, the electricity consumption is higher at hot weather than cold weather. These changes in the minimum mortality temperature and the relative risk, they of course has to do with factors, modifying factors that have changed over time. And we believe that heat wave plans, which has led to better understanding within the health sector, but also among the general public, is one important factor to reduce the effect of heat exposure. So my conclusions then: more frequent and intensive heat waves is a global problem, but it's important also in cold countries. Heat waves have been mostly studied in Europe and North America, and seldom in countries like India or in most parts of Africa. So we do not know so well the effects of heat waves from some parts of the world. We have several indicators that can be used to study time trends in heat-related mortality, and they yield different answers, whether we study absolute effects or relative effects on mortality. Generally, we see that minimum mortality temperature have increased, so we tolerate higher temperatures, but climate change and demographic changes may still increase the burden. And the adaptive measures, such as heat wave action plans and warning systems, are not so well, the effects of those are not so well described. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, those were conclusions looking backward. What are now the projections going forward? Health impact and climate change. We have Maria Vicedo from University of Bern with us to look ahead.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers for the opportunity of being here. I'm very honored, and congratulations so far on the excellent event. So today, yes, this session is about heat stress, and you will see that I'm going to talk about heat for a while. But today I'm going to focus on this specific piece of research or research field that now is kind of a trending topic in climate epidemiology. And maybe I will touch some things beyond the heat part. For example, in one of my examples that I'm going to start with, but in a way it's very important for me because it goes very close to my heart, as I will show you in a second. So if I tell you 29th October 2024, I bet that for most of you don't remember what you were doing that day, I'm sure. I do remember, and many people that I know also know it, also remembers that, because actually it was when these devastating floods affected the surroundings area of Valencia, barely 30 kilometers away from my hometown. There were, huge amount of economic loss. I don't know how many cars destroyed, as you could see, houses. It affected 30 municipalities, more or less. So just to give an idea about the vast, extensive, impact of this massive event. And what is worse, more than 200 people died just because of this event. So, as you could imagine, in the aftermath of these extreme weather events, there are many questions that are raised in informal and formal conversations. And of course, when it comes to climate, is really how much can we blame climate change for this? And in a way, we know that after this event, there were different groups that they did what they call these rapid attribution studies, and they found that 12%, so basically climate change increased the probability by 12% of having an event of this magnitude in this location. So in a way, the fingerprint of climate change was there. But I would say that for us working on health, we should go a little bit beyond that, right? And the idea is that maybe what we would like to know is how much of the observed and unobserved health burden can be attributed to climate change. So it's really to go towards this idea of impacts. It's not only to say these many people were affected, is how much of these people, actually, how many of these people would have not been affected in absence of climate change. So when I say observe and unobserved, it's like, because, yeah, I'm sorry to say, you don't need an epidemiologist for quantifying how many people died directly because of this event, because it was obvious, you just have to count the numbers. It's really what we want to do as epidemiologists, to quantify the invisible public health consequences of this event. These pictures actually were taken by my friend. She's a surgeon in my hometown. She volunteered to go into the area for helping and assist the population there. And she was actually telling me already of these invisible, let's say, impacts that she was already noticing. People with diarrhea, people with different kind of infections, as well people with very poor mental health. And also the days after, there were several peaks of poor air pollution just because of the mud was already dry. And eventually the wind just pull up all the particles in the air, and people had to wear masks during this period because the air was terrible at that days. So as you could imagine, understanding this impact on health of the population, especially when it happens related to such tremendous health event, climate event, is something that it comes as a priority and is becoming more and more relevant in every sphere in our world, not only in the academic world. So this is really what this, let's say, group, this research field wants to do, is to understand the human fingerprint of climate change. So basically the anthropogenic contribution to climate change. And as you could imagine, this is central to the story of climate change. I mean, it's how everything started. We know that there are these kind of gases that we call greenhouse gases that we emit in the atmosphere that makes eventually the world to be warmer and then potentially leading to more extreme weather events. This is obvious, yes, but we know as scientists we need to have some numbers, something, evidence that we can prove and we can show to different policymakers and different stakeholders. And the idea is that what we want, as I said, is to go through this causal chain up to what is now becoming more relevant, is really up to the impacts, in this case, health impacts. The idea of this kind of research is called detection and attribution studies, and it has been going in the climate, let's say, sphere for many years. It's a central research area in climate change research, and this is one of the first studies that were published at that time. It was led by Peter Stott, and basically what he quantified based on the 2003 heat wave is that basically with high confidence that human influence has at least double the risk of a heat wave exceeding this threshold magnitude. So basically to identify and quantify the anthropogenic fingerprint of observed extreme weather events that we are experiencing during the last years. But instead, let's say that this area of attribution has been developed very strongly during the last years for the climate sphere, but not so much on the health side. And actually, as I will show you in a second, it's really an emerging field. But luckily, there were some seminal works that were published a few years ago that in a way they let them set the path to what the research that we are conducting nowadays. The first one is a study that was conducted by the group in OMIA, and they used data from Stockholm, and basically they quantify that mortality from extreme heat streams between 1980 and 2009 in Stockholm was double what would have been occurred without climate change. On the other side, we have another work that was, again, very relevant at that time, that was led by Doug Mitchell from the UK, and they focused on this tremendous heat wave in the 2003 in the city of Paris and in London, and they estimated that anthropogenic climate change increased the risk of heat-related mortality in central Paris by 70% and by 20% in London. So as you could imagine, these findings are striking, are clear, are shocking. And that's why we are now investing more and more efforts in trying to clarify and to quantify and give a number of the, let's say, the contribution of anthropogenic activities to the observed heat or whatever other environmental factor related to climate change. So the idea is that more recently, we, as part of a large consortium, that is the multi-country, multi-city collaborative research network, we conducted another attribution study, quasi-global one. In this case, we included data from 43 countries, and we estimated that 37% of the heat-related deaths could be attributed to human-induced climate change during the last 30 years. So saying in other words, 1 out of 3 deaths would have been avoided if we wouldn't have climate change or anthropogenic activities. Again, this highlights the relevance of this kind of research. We are putting numbers to the contribution of anthropogenic activities. But more recently, there have been other studies that in a way try to expand more the knowledge on this area. And for example, just to give an example, a study led by the group in PIC, they on that side, they wanted to focus more on infant mortality and temperature, providing clear evidence on the impact of anthropogenic activities in infant mortality in different countries in developing regions. And as well on the other side, there are as well other efforts in trying to clarify the anthropogenic fingerprint in observed patterns in vector-borne diseases. In this case, was West Nile virus in Europe. So as you could see, we are developing new research, new ideas, new areas that in a way would provide extremely important evidence for different bodies. But the thing is that we know that today, although it's an emerging field, it still remains very biased. In the sense, in this report that was published, or let's say conducted by the Wellcome Trust, they assessed the evidence or the different health impacts to attribution studies, and they found that actually there were just a handful of studies available. So far it was, I think it was published 2 years ago, and most of it was really focused or in a way concentrated in the areas and in the topics or health outcomes for which the data was available. Because we know, for us working in epidemiology, we know that the health data is most of the times the limiting factor in our studies. So based on this this report. Well, Contrast, they try to push a little bit more the science in this field, and also leveraging kind of other activities that were going on and other kind of trends. For example, it's clear that, as I said before, this kind of research provides another dimension about the impacts of climate change. As well, it's a nice setting for creating synergies with climate attributed science, so really working with climate scientists. As well, it provides, as I said, relevant findings, but more importantly, we are seeing that nowadays there is more available data that we can use in our epidemiological studies. So, but I was trying to convince you how relevant this science is, but I want you to give you some examples, so clear, notes on why I want you to understand this. So the point is, why causation is so important. I mean, we are always interested in causes, right? But in this specific area and in the topic of climate change, of course, because it helps us in decision-making processes. If we know the cause, supposedly we will do something to avoid it. I say supposedly because otherwise we won't be here. And as well, we know that understanding the cause and communicating the cause can help as well understanding the processes. So it's an important tool for communication of the impacts of climate change. And as well, of course, it has important ethical considerations. When I say ethical considerations, I want to show you this example. I don't know if you are familiar with this case. It's the Klima Seniorinnen case, Schweiz. It's basically a group of women, old women in Switzerland, that a few years ago they sued the Swiss government because they were not ambitious enough in the different mitigation policies. So they claimed to the national court that basically the government was not doing enough for protect their health. It was rejected from the court, and they decided to go to the European Court of Human Rights a few years ago. And in April last year, they got the decision from the court, and it was favorable for this group of women, which it was a landmark decision for many other climate litigation causes that are now underway. I'm telling you this because at that time, when all this process was in a way in gestation, I had the opportunity to get in touch with a group of researchers of the University of Bern, and especially led by Charlotte Blattner. She's a lawyer working on climate law. And she said, we should participate in this case by putting together what is called a third-party intervention. This third-party intervention, what it is, in a way, is an expert report that you can submit to the court for the different let's say, judges to have an idea of the science that is going on. It's an objective report. It's not something coming from activism or whatever. The idea is we put together our science, not all the science that was available, and to try to support the case. So we did it, and for me, I would say that it was one of the most enriching activities that I have participated outside the academia, because at that time, we were conducting an attribution study in Switzerland, actually focused on the 2022 summer, where it was tremendous in Switzerland as well. And we quantified what was the number of people dying due to heat attributed to anthropogenic activities. And our findings confirm the story of the seniors, because we found that actually 60% of the deaths that were due to heat at that time, during that summer, were due to climate change, to anthropogenic activities, but more importantly, out of these 60%, more than half was happening in old women. So in a way, this evidence was extremely relevant for the case, and for me was, in a way, very important to at least hear the judges that they listened, they read our report, and they used it for putting the case together. So when it comes to the idea of attribution science, I think that it's an emerging field in every single sector, not only in the health sector. And it's an interdisciplinary endeavor. And also it helps, or the way the critical point here is that it really needs kind of a realignment of different methods and data from different disciplines. So it's a very nice interdisciplinary sector or platform to work together with climate scientists and other impact sectors. But as I said, our knowledge is extremely biased and is partial. And the idea is that now there are kind of growing efforts in trying to tackle this bias in the research and try to expand geographically and across different health outcomes these kind of studies. And this is basically what especially Well Contrast is trying to push, and more importantly, to not only to us in the global north doing the research, is to provide the tools for those more affected to develop their own research. And this is exactly what we are planning to do, is basically to help improving capacity building and have an active dialogue with stakeholders and establish best practice, let's say, methodologies based on this project that we are now starting and in Bern, that is together with other projects that have been funded by the Wellcome Trust to try advancing the knowledge on the impacts of climate change on health of the population. So with this, I would like to finish. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.